there are occasions when my sons and I will have conversations, and they want to know about what the ancient times of the 1900s were like. And when we talk about that, there's a number of things that I begin to realize that they'll never experience. One of the things I realized recently was just the power of the newspaper in their lives they'll never know, right? Like getting their picture in the paper when you're playing sports, or the achievements that are in there, just that'll never register with them. Or looking for a job, right? Used to be, if you weren't pounding the pavement or finding a help wanted sign, you had to pour over the classifieds, right? Look for somebody hiring. Well, now 80% of people exclusively use the internet to search for their jobs. It's the easiest, most convenient way to work. A lot of people don't know that there are also websites just for jobs in churches or ministries. These Christian job boards, and the numbers are even higher there. Over 90% of people looking for jobs in that kind of market rely on the internet, rely online. And I heard somebody who ran one of those websites once talk about the day that they get the most traffic, the day that their website gets the most visitors, the day they get the most applicants, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is Monday morning. Because pastors leave their churches on Sundays and say, I've had enough. I don't want to go back. And they want to run somewhere else. I want to go. It's not even necessarily because there's problems or because there's some struggles or there was some fight. They're just overwhelmed. They're struggling, and their solution is to find a different ministry. The studies show this. 90% of pastors say they're worn out every week. 91% say they've experienced burnout. 70% say they struggle with depression and loneliness because they have no friends. This is not some form of confession for me, I promise you. What it is the reality of the states of our ministers in 2026. And I would be lying to you if I said I was never a part of those statistics in my 26 years of ministry. Because the truth is what we experience is this. The trip from the top of the mountain, where we experience God and we have this mountaintop experience and we feel so close to Him, the trip from there to the valley is a really short one. And you get there really quickly. And I'm sharing that with you because it's exactly what we see play out in the book of 1 Kings today, in chapter 19. Where literally, the last time we looked, Elijah has a mountaintop experience where he calls fire from heaven. You can't get any more like amazing presence of God than what Elijah's just experienced. And the next day, he's sitting in the desert, literally prays, I've had enough and I want to die. The trip from the mountain to the valley is very short. And I know that some of you are in that valley today. The same valley we're going to see Elijah in. Worn out, discouraged, depressed, given up. And I want to take a moment and look not just at Elijah's trip there, but his experience there. And how God meets him there. In the midst of all of that. And what he finds from God that I believe that you can find today in your valleys. So we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19. And before we begin to read there, it's been a couple weeks, so let's refresh you, or if you haven't been with us. Our journey so far, Elijah shows up in 1 Kings 17, and he goes to King Ahab, and he says to King Ahab, I'm going to show you that Yahweh is the living God, and there's going to be a drought. until I pray there's not a drought. And it came. There's a drought. And for 3.5 years, Elijah lives in hiding in different places where God protects him and provides for him. Until God, in 1 Kings 18, shows up and tells Elijah, hey, it's time for it to rain again. And so Elijah, through Obadiah, sets up a meeting with Ahab. Ahab blames Elijah for the drought. And then Elijah says, let's prove who's the real God here, Yahweh or Baal, the gods that you guys have been worshiping. Let's have a contest. And so they set up a contest on Mount Carmel. Elijah on one side, 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah on the other side. They get a chance to call fire from heaven. Their God doesn't answer. Yahweh answers Elijah. Fire falls from heaven, consumes the sacrifice. The 450 prophets of Baal are killed as judgment for their participation in the purging and murder of the prophets of Yahweh. Elijah then not only prays and the drought ends, but the last we saw, Elijah is running ahead of Ahab's chariot. Ahab, this unfaithful king who's led his people into idol worship, is, in this moment at least, seemingly changed. He's seen the fire from God. He's seen this drought end, and he's a changed man, and he's headed home to his wife Jezebel. And when he comes home, what do you think Elijah tells Jezebel about what he just saw on Mount Carmel? Listen, verse 1. When Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah, may the gods strike me and even kill me, if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them. But first of all, notice this. What did Ahab tell Jezebel? Did Ahab tell Jezebel what God had done on Mount Carmel? Nope, no indication that she hears anything about fire or a drought ending or any of that. Let me tell you what Elijah just did. He killed all your prophets. Jezebel, in response to that, threatens Elijah's life, which is not an empty threat. She has killed prophets of God for years at this point. But Elijah has just been on this mountain, has just seen the fire of God, how God answers his prophets, and how the prophets of Baal and the people who follow him, that's empty. Those are empty threats. So Elijah isn't scared of this threat, right? Verse 3. Elijah was afraid, and he fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died. Elijah's afraid, and fear motivates his actions. What he does next is not in response to a calling of God, is not in response to God's will, it's in a response to fear. He runs away. First it says he goes to Beersheba, which is the southernmost point of Judah. And when he's there, he doesn't stay there. That's as far away as he can get. But King Jehoshaphat is friends with King Ahab. And if you remember back in chapter 18, Obadiah told Elijah that Ahab went to all the kings around to find where Elijah was. And so Elijah's experience is, this isn't safe here, so I got to keep going. So he presses on into the wilderness. Notice he leaves his servant behind. He leaves that person behind to go all alone. And he sits under a broom tree. A broom tree is a bush. It's about 5 to 10 feet tall. It's one of the only places where you could find shade in the desert there. This is the same kind of tree that Jonah sat under after Nineveh repents and is saved. A solitary broom tree. It's all by itself. He sits under there, and then he prays. That's a key word, then. He doesn't pray at the beginning, does he? When his life's threatened. He doesn't pray for direction on where to go. He doesn't pray for direction on what to do. He responds in fear, and then in the midst of his running away, he's not done running away. He's in the middle of it. Then he prays. And it says he prays that he would die. Now, that is a foolish prayer, isn't it? Not because we're never in a place where we feel that way. But if he wanted to die, he didn't need to run away, did he? If he wanted to die, he could stay right where he was, and Jezebel would have killed him. So what I want you to hear is, I don't believe Elijah's really praying. You know, people say that. That's an expression, like, I want to die, I don't want to live anymore. They don't really mean that. There's something else behind that, right? They're confessing that where their life is right now, they're not happy with, and they don't want it to be there. What is it that Elijah's confessing? Well, we keep reading, and he says, I've had enough, and I want to die, because I'm no better than my ancestors who've died before me. What does that mean? What is he saying? He's not talking about his family. He's talking about prophets. The prophets that have come before him. And he's saying these prophets that came before me have died, and they all failed to change the hearts of the people of Israel. And now I've done all the things. I've climbed the mountains. I've prayed a fire from heaven, drought, no drought. I've done it all, and they haven't changed. Elijah's prayer is not a prayer of, it's not suicide. It's failure. It's Elijah confessing, I failed. And I've done all the right things. I've said all the right things. I've prayed all the right prayers. I followed all the right things. And at the end of the day, nothing is different. So I quit. I'm done. I give up. And suddenly when we hear that prayer under that broom tree, we all know what Elijah is feeling in this moment, don't we? I bet every single one of us has been there at some point in our lives. And if you haven't been, you will be someday. Where you feel like everything you've done is for naught. And that nothing you've done has had any effect on anything. You feel like a failure. And you just want to give up and quit. And in that moment, Elijah's prayer is, I want to die. I don't want to live anymore. And God answers his prayer, but not the prayer of his lips. He answers the prayer of his heart. In verse 5, what we see is then Elijah lay down, and he slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, get up, eat some more, for the journey ahead will be too much for you. So he got up and he ate and drank, and the food gave him strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. God meets him under that broom tree. And he doesn't ask for God to provide for him, but that's what God does. God gives him the things he needs in that moment to take the next steps, the steps that he's giving up on, the steps that he doesn't want to take. God gives him what he needs, provides what he needs to keep pressing forward. While Elijah's praying, I want to die, God knows that's not really what he wants. His heart is crying out for something more. And God doesn't always answer the prayers of our lips, but he knows the depths of our hearts. He knows what we need better than we know for ourselves what we need. And that's what he answers. He gives us what we need for the journey ahead. He hears what our hearts are crying out for, what our hearts are longing for, and that's what he answers. Now, we will see that that's not the end of this journey. We're going to look there later, but I want to stop under this broom tree for a moment. What is it that brings Elijah to that point? Because now we can look at what gets him out from under there and how God delivers him from this. But if we don't understand what gets us there in the first place and how we end up there, alone in the wilderness, in our loneliness and despair, then we'll never emerge from it. So I'm going to take and ask this question: what causes us to get under that broom tree? What caused Elijah to get under there? Because I believe we'll see the same things that are true in our lives. So first of all, fear gets Elijah under that broom tree. The Word of God spells it out. It's the first thing it says, right? Elijah's afraid. He runs away. Now, we could debate whether Elijah should have been afraid or not, whether his fear was of something that he should have been or shouldn't have been afraid of. But we do know this, that God had protected Elijah. Elijah's life had been threatened for a long time, and God had always provided and protected him. But in this moment, his Jezebel was bigger than his God. And he ran away. And that's under the broom tree sometime we find ourselves, that the problems that we face in life, the threats that we have, the struggles that we're going through, for us in that moment, in our minds, are bigger than God. And we know it's not true, and yet for us, that's how it feels in that moment. And when we find ourselves there, we end up under that broom tree. Second, there's weariness. You know, we can talk about how Elijah has this great day, and he's at the top of the mountain, and this great miracle happens, and he should be excited. But the truth is this: it wasn't one day. Elijah has been hiding for 3.5 years. And for 3.5 years, he has been surviving, not knowing where his food was coming the next day. And so what I think Elijah's going through is this. If you're running a marathon, and to be clear, I've never run a marathon. I'm just presuming the misery that comes with running a marathon, right? Let's say you're running a marathon and you can see the finish line up ahead. You see the crowd, you see the line, and so you give it a little more effort, right? You sprint for that finish so that it's finally over, and then when you get there, you realize that it's the halfway point. What happens in that moment? How do you feel? Suddenly, there's a wash of weariness that comes over you, right? There's a discouragement that happens. I thought I was done, but I've got a long way to go. That's what I think's happened to Elijah. He thought Mount Carmel was the end. It was an exclamation point on the sentence of his journey, and he wakes up the next morning, and nothing's different. He's still going, and he's worn out, and he's tired from it, and he doesn't want to run anymore. The journey to serve God and live for Him is a marathon. It doesn't end quickly. And sometimes that weariness comes in when our eyes are focused on the wrong things. We think we see the end, but instead of being focused on God and what He has for us. Number 3, there's loneliness. Elijah says he's alone, and in the coming passages, we're going to hear him talk about this even more. But here's the thing. Is he alone? Has he been alone? When he was in Zarephath, he had a widow, and the widow's son had to wake up every day and trust for God to provide just like he did. He has a servant journeying with him. He leaves the servant behind, right? And then ends up and says, God, look, I'm all alone. Nobody will come with me. That's a choice that he made, isn't it? But it's his perception that he's all alone, that he's in this by himself, that he's got nobody with him. For Elijah, and I think often for us, loneliness is a perception rather than a reality. It's a position that we put our lives in. because we're afraid, because we're weary. So, see, we think the loneliness is a cause of the fear and is a cause of the weariness, but really the feeling of loneliness comes from being afraid and weary. It's the opposite. That's the way it happens in Elijah. That's not to say that nobody experiences loneliness and that's not real, because it is real for many of you. But sometimes that feeling comes from something else and not from reality. Wherefore, Elijah is busy, and busyness leads to him under the broom tree. Just think of this flurry of activity. Just the day before, he's got all this stuff going on where he has to go see Ahab. He has to go up the mountain. He has to build an altar. He has to get a bull ready for sacrifice. He has to face these 450 prophets of Baal. He has to make fun of the 450 prophets of Baal. He has to pray for God to send fire down from heaven. And then, not only that, he has to oversee and, from all accounts, participate in the killing of 450 prophets of Baal. And then he's got to run ahead of a chariot. Not to mention, this whole day he's been walking up and down a mountain. And then at the end of that busyness, this happens. And we see this. His focus was on all the tasks, when all the things that he had to do, rather than on what God was doing. He's doing all the right things, right? It wasn't that he was doing wrong things, but in the midst of the busyness, he forgot why he was doing them and who he was doing them for. And sometimes we allow this busyness to consume our focus to the point where we end up and ask ourselves, how did I even get here? What am I even doing? So we say, I'm giving up. I'm not doing any more. I've done enough and it hasn't worked. Forgetting who we were doing it for and why we were doing it. Busyness steals that focus that we should be using to focus and concentrate on what God is doing. Number 5, he's disillusioned. To be disillusioned means you have an idea or a vision of what's going to happen, of what life is going to look like. And you think you know what the end result of your current situation is. And then one day you wake up and you realize that wasn't real. So for Elijah, the disillusionment was that Mount Carmel was the end, when really it was more like the beginning. He had a lot more work to do. For Elijah, what we're going to find is the disillusionment is that he's all alone, that he's got to fight for God on his own, and we're going to find out that is not true, that there are many others doing what he's doing. When we have a plan, when we think we know what's going to happen, when we think we understand what God is going to do, when that day comes, when we realize that's all wrong, you end up under that broom tree. Your world comes crashing in on you. That leads to number 6, become depressed. Disillusionment leads to depression. When the things we think are going to fix our life don't fix our life. When I think if I just get the new job, if I get that promotion, then I won't have to be with those people anymore. Then my life will have more purpose. This job will give me more meaning. I'll find new things. And then you go to the new job and you realize there's people there too. And they're just as miserable as the other people. And this job's just as hard, and there's just as many menial tasks, and your problem's not solved. You just traded one for another. If I just had more money, then I could have more. I could quit the job. I could buy bigger. I could buy better. I could get a nicer house. I could pay off the debt. And what we find out is all we did was we trade smaller debts for bigger debts, smaller bills for bigger bills, and more is not more. Because when we trust in the things of this world, when our disillusionment says, if I just had this, then my life would be okay, you are going to end up depressed under that broom tree, because none of them work. None of them are the answer to your problems. Now, I want to be clear, there are a lot of causes of depression in our lives. There are a lot of things that cause that. But spiritually, What Elijah's experiencing is a spiritual depression. And it's a very real thing. And Elijah's experiencing it because he thinks he's got it all figured out. And he thinks he's trusting in these solutions to his problems, and he's realizing what he thought was a solution isn't. He's come crashing down. You hit rock bottom. You think everything I'm doing is a waste of time. It's pointless. That all that kind of depression comes from this disillusionment. Last thing. We end up under that broom tree because we have a distorted perspective. At the end of the day, what is Elijah focused on? He's focused on what didn't happen. The people didn't change. Jezebel didn't change. My life didn't change. And at no point is he focused on the fact that the day before, at 2 sentences, literal fire fell down from heaven. That hasn't even registered to him this day. He hasn't even thought about it, hasn't talked about it. He's looking at all the things that didn't happen instead of celebrating the things that God did do and what did happen in those moments. He can only think of the prayers that God didn't answer rather than the ones he did. He only sees the problem. He only sees what didn't change. He only sees what's left to do. But the God who answered with fire and rain, the God who protected him for years in all the different places of his life, the God that's provided for him every single day that he was in need, that God is still there, that God is still real, whether Elijah sees him or not. And when people and our problems get very big, we often make God very small. And he becomes a smaller and smaller part of our life. And when we do that, we end up under the broom tree. There's a preacher named Charles Spurgeon. Yesterday was the anniversary of his death in 1892. But that name, even though he's been dead for over 130 years, a lot of you recognize that name. His sermons are still read. People still listen to the things that he had to say. At the age of 22, he became known as the Prince of Preachers. He was the most popular pastor around, and they had to build a 6,000-person tabernacle to hold the people that would come listen to him preach in London. They estimate that over 10 million people listened to Charles Spurgeon preach. In today's day and age, that might not seem significant. There was no internet. There was no television, right? That's people that traveled, came to London to hear him preach the Word of God. By all measures of worldly success, Charles Spurgeon was influential. Charles Spurgeon was successful. But the reality is, Charles Spurgeon was depressed for almost his entire ministry. It began when he was 22. The room he was in was full. Some young men thought that it would be funny to yell fire. And the church evacuated, and 7 people were trampled to death. He almost quit preaching at that moment, thinking if this is going to bring people into danger, I don't want to do this anymore. At 33, he began to have chronic pain, so much that there were many Sundays he would wake up and he couldn't physically make it to the pulpit. This came back later in his life. He struggled with all the same kind of church problems that any church struggles with over 40 years. When he was older, his grandson unexpectedly died. He had all these struggles, all of these heartaches. And in a sermon, he once said this. He said he echoed what Job felt. Here's the passage of Job. He says, I feel like Job. Job 7:15, my soul chooseth strangling rather than life. I could have readily enough had laid violent hands upon myself to escape from the misery of my spirit. He would write letters and he confessed to a friend, I've never lost my faith in God, but at times I've been so depressed that the cable has been strained to the limit. We have one of the greatest preachers in the modern era who, by all measures, was successful, was influential, impacted the church and the world greatly for the kingdom of God, respected, revered, and depressed. And for many people, many Christians, they don't believe that those words can go together. Because, hey, we know Jesus. We have joy and peace and grace and love. So something like depression could never be a part of our lives. And then we look at the Word of God and see Elijah sitting under a broom tree, literally resigning from his prophetic occupation, struggling from that same kind of depression. Sometimes we imagine that these men or women that, like Elijah or Charles Spurgeon, are some kind of spiritual superheroes, or that because men and women are on a stage and hold a Bible and speak, that there's something extra special about us, when there's not. When these men or women that serve God, that their lives are different, that they must be so happy, that they must have all this figured out. And what we see here is that these men and women are just like everyone else. Broken, sinful, struggling. So when you hear Elijah's prayer today, when you hear that prayer, I've had enough, I want you to hear in that prayer that sometimes strong people aren't strong. I want you to hear that sometimes brave people aren't brave. I want you to hear that sometimes loving people aren't always loving. I want you to hear that trusting people still have doubts and fear. I want you to hear that broken spirits and shattered dreams come to everyone. And they often come at the most unsuspected times. I want you to hear that discouragement, depression, a distorted perspective, they are something that we all battle because we're all frail, we're all broken, we're all weak. But hear this. In our brokenness, under that broom tree, God is saying to you, you don't have to stay that way. You don't have to stay there forever. He's saying your Jezebels don't have to be bigger than your God. Elijah would have said, of course that's not true. Of course Jezebel isn't greater than God. And yet we see him running away in fear. Second, we overcome by realizing you cannot run away from your problems and fears. It is impossible. Elijah literally will end up as far away from Jezebel as he can. And do you know what's still true when he ends up there? She still wants to kill him. No matter how far he runs, it doesn't change the problem in his life. Number 3, you get out from under that broom tree realizing it's okay to have enough. It's okay to be hurting and need help. It's okay to be discouraged. What's not okay is letting yourself stay that way, becoming content in that depression, becoming content in that helplessness, and allowing fear and pain and discouragement to be what runs your life. Fourth, God will meet you there. And he will bring you what you need, just like he did for Elijah. You may not even know what you need. Elijah didn't ask for bread, he didn't ask for water, he didn't ask for anything God gave him, but God brought him what he needed. Not what he asked for. God brought him what he needed. Finally, if you really want to make it out from under that broom tree, if you really don't want to stay stuck in that place, you have to trust God's perspective more than your own. In the next passage, we're going to see God call out Elijah's perspective and show him how he's wrong about how he sees things. But before we get there, I want you to consider for a moment that what God sees of your life is not what you see of your life. That what God sees of your future is not what you see of your future. That perhaps you have no idea what's coming. But He does. Trust that. More than you trust what you see, trust what He sees that you cannot. Trust His perspective. Charles Spurgeon found a way to deal with his depression. He found a way to deal with his discouragement. In an era where depression wasn't a word, and it wasn't diagnosed, and it wasn't medicated, it never went away. He struggled with it his entire life. And just a few years before he died, he preached these words. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up as you hear this confession from him. This morning, being myself more than usually compassed with infirmities, I desire to speak as a weak and suffering preacher of the high priest who's full of compassion, and my longing is that any who are low in spirit, faint, despondent, and even out of the way may take heart to approach the Lord Jesus. Because Jesus is touched not with your feeling of strength, but of your infirmity. Down here, poor, feeble nothings affect the heart of their great high priest on high, who was crowned with glory and honor. As the mother feels with the weakness of her babe, so does Jesus feel with the poorest, saddest, and weakest of His chosen. You might come here today broken and weak and hurting, given up. You've had enough. God is there with you. I want you to hear today that the same God who visited Elijah in his wilderness, that same God is here today in your life. That same God will visit you. That same God has what you need. Like a Charles Spurgeon, like Elijah, we live with these pains. We live with this brokenness. Some of you are carrying these things today, these people today that haven't changed yet, no matter how hard you've prayed and longed for. But what we cling to today is not the strength of our faith. What we cling to today is the faithfulness of God. The God who met Elijah is the same God who meets us here. So may we remember what He's brought to our lives. We're going to come in a moment to this table and remember all that He's done for us, that He met us in our sinfulness and gave us hope of overcoming the greatest of enemies, the greatest of fears, the greatest of brokenness. So may we stand now and worship Him and sing this song and be reminded that the God who was there is the God who is here. The same God who died for us is the same God who gives us life today. May we sing this in praise to Him.